We can say that it was for example, a NATO operation, but the country, as you mentioned, is responsible for what has happened.
Yes.
And how do you see the retaliatory actions from Russia? How do you think that could escalate the situation between,
Well,
somehow?
there will be retaliation. When President Putin, Foreign Minister Lavrov, and many others have made it very clear that for piracy on the high seas, there will be asymmetric retaliation. And we've seen that in the Black Sea. The retaliation has been principally against the drone bases, the British sea missile bases are in and around Odessa. And the retaliation took place with Russian missile and Russian drone attacks on Odessa port and the ports around in Odessa in retaliation for the Black Sea attacks. And one of those targets was a Turkish vessel in December this month. And there was a discussion of the matter on December the 12th when President Putin met President Erdogan. They don't mention that they discussed the Black Sea retaliation. And Erdogan has suggested that there might be a sort of moratorium on energy targeting, a nonsense proposition because the Ukrainians have been offered that all year almost by President Putin since February and refused. Now, the question you raised, the issue of retaliation is now much more serious because it's outside, let's say, the relatively limited regional theater of the Black Sea. If it's the Estonians, for example, or the Poles are threatening Russian vessels moving through the Gulf of Finland and into the Baltic Sea and heading towards the Danish Straits. If the Danes start to threaten Russian navigation through the narrow Danish Straits and turn the Danish Straits into a choke point like the Strait of Hormuz, if the French do what they've done, which is stop and search and inspect Russian vessels or Russian cargoes moving southward parallel to the French coast in the Atlantic. This is to extend to the high seas, not the territorial waters, the war against Russian navigation, the war against Russian trade, the war against Russia. And that's the issue of what retaliation will Russia come up with to deal with that. There's a perception, and you can read it, our audience can read it in the Western press, that if the Russian side attacks a NATO vessel, that's equivalent to an Article 5 incident. In other words, the NATO feels it can attack Russian vessels by calling the attacker a Ukrainian drone, an SBU operation. This is nonsense. But if Russia retaliates against a US flag or British flagged vessel or French flagged vessel or German vessel or a German owned or a Polish owned or a NATO owned vessel, is that an attack on NATO territory? And would that attack, quotes, though retaliatory in kind, constitute a provocation that would engage NATO fully against Russia? You can see the provocative character that we're talking about here. Let's say the armchair warriors in Brussels, particularly the Baltic states, particularly the Poles, particularly the British, who get less and less important as we go along. The British are left with deception operations and secret pinprick operations. Putin doesn't even refer to Prime Minister Starmer now. The real war-making and the peacemaking negotiations now involve France, Germany, and the United States. Britain is out. So you can also see from a British or small European country point of view, why don't we provoke the Russian bear? Let's stick a pin in him at sea. And let's see if he attacks one of our vessels, which would then bring us all back together again. So you can see that from a NATO minority point of view, from those who think that they can continue the war against Russia and will not accept that the Ukraine war has been lost, those who want to break from France maybe and not allow negotiations directly with Russia, as Macron has suggested the last few days. You can see the value they think in their heads, not of provoking Russia into retaliating in one of these places. And this is the sort of mentality we're dealing with. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. John, you mentioned Europe, and Europe is somehow divided, even in the western part of Europe. We're not talking about,
Yes.
the eastern and the west. And in the western part of Europe, we have some sort of divisions between, for example, Macron and Merz.
Yes.
And do you think that they, after all, can they bring a strategy altogether? I'm talking about the western part of Europe. Or as time goes by, we see these sort of differences widening?
I think you hit the nail on the head there, Nima. The differences are widening. And these are profound differences. The attempt by the German chancellor, remember he's a 28% election mandate chancellor. He's a weakling politically at home. And we can go back and explain the German domestic politics. And you've got some good German experts too who can explain it. The split that Merz triggered over pushing the European Union into pledging and moving Russian assets into directly financing the war in the Ukraine, and then triggering Italian and French explicit resistance and tacit resistance backing the Hungarians, the Czechs, and the Slovaks. This is serious, and it reflects an underlying point which we need to emphasize. I think most of your colleagues have. I think Lawrence Wilkinson has, and others have. Germany is not trusted in the rest of Europe. Why should anyone trust the Germans ever again? Okay? Now, what Merz is doing, Friedrich Merz, the 28% mini chancellor of Germany, is using the Ukraine war platform to push rearmament of Germany, using the lure that he will buy US arms to draw Trump's support and establish Germany as the largest military power in Europe. That's clearly never going to be acceptable to the French. The British have their own history of dalliance with Hitler, the history of understanding that Hitler's fascism was the cure for Soviet communism. That was a line that Joe Kennedy, then ambassador to the UK, used to run to President Roosevelt in 38-40 when Kennedy was ambassador of the United States to the UK. There has always been an underlying British passion for allying with Germany against Russia. But right now the situation is that Merz is opposed by Macron. and the Russian side has welcomed with some skepticism Macron's announcement that we, meaning Europe, should have direct talks and direct relations and negotiations with Russia, for obvious reason too. Macron said it. We can't let the Americans negotiate a most favored agreement for the settlement of the Ukraine conflict. There, the French and the Germans and the British are sitting back watching a business mouthpiece like Kirill Dmitriev go to Miami and discuss with two US business mouthpieces, Jared Kushner and Stephen Witkoff, terms of settling the war. Well, no diplomats there, no military person there. What are they talking about? They're talking about money. And it's very clear that to the French, to the Germans, to the British, to the Italians, that if they don't actively engage with Putin directly, the US will take all the money off the table at the end of the war with Ukraine. And that's unacceptable to them too. So from a European point of view, and it's a very civilized point of view, and it remembers who really won, who really caused the last war, the Merz initiatives will be opposed, and not simply by Russia. And the Russian sources I talked to understand this is obvious and are puzzled that it's taken the French, the Italians, and the others so long to figure it out. But here we are now, and they're figuring it out. Merz is German rearmament. Merz is Germany will lead Europe against Russia. France's view is we need to have a different European security arrangement. And if the US won't fund us, we'll have to fund it too. And from a Russian point of view, as I talked to my sources in Moscow, the French are seen to have allies with Meloni of Italy and the Danes, for example. So there is a fierce argument now over the future of Europe between the old historical rivals and war makers, particularly the German war makers. And this is very important for all of us to understand.
John, the negotiations by Kirill Dmitriev and you mentioned Steve Witkoff on the part of the United States together with Kushner, what are the difficulties as we talk between the United States and Russia? And is that possible for these people? Are they capable of coming up with some sort of solutions? Because as you mentioned, these are not diplomats, these are businessmen. And I don't know how in this, the settlement in Ukraine, in my opinion, is a huge diplomatic work. It's not something like, some sort of deal between these businessmen. What is your understanding of what's going on between these people, among these people?
Good question. I've asked my Russian sources the same question. Several different answers. First of all, yes, everybody recognizes it's a very peculiar negotiating format now, in which excludes foreign ministry of each side. The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is not a fan of Kirill Dmitriev. He's tried to push him away from the negotiations that have gone on with the United States since the first meeting that took place after Trump came to power in Riyadh. Yes, the foreign ministry has been sidelined in this negotiation to date. However, the Kremlin kept its finger on the negotiation by the direct involvement of Yuri Ushakov, the president's foreign affairs advisor. Ushakov, we now know, makes telephone calls and has telephone conversations with Witkoff because the Bloomberg people have graciously leaked some of the misunderstood text of their conversations. In what's happening, however, my Russian sources say a couple of things. First of all, Dmitriev is talking to Vitkov for the purpose of creating arousing let's say, you could say the greed of the Trump circle, or you could say the economic incentives, commercial incentives, or you could say the bribes involved in reaching a peace settlement that would see Trump dump Zelensky. In other words, it's a carrot, a very juicy one, the Russian side is holding out so that Vitkov can persuade those elements of the Trump administration in Pentagon, in State Department, National Security Council, and in the intelligence agencies of the desirability of reaching a deal. They're not really, as my Russian sources say, empowered. Dmitriev's not empowered to discuss territorial issues, military issues, or the diplomatic texts of, let's say, security guarantees. He's there to say, let's make a deal on the terms that Trump personally, his family, represented by Kushner, and his bagmen, represented by Vitkov, and there are others, can understand and can want. On the Russian side, in the last few days, I've heard also a very interesting line, which goes to the points 13 and 14 of the original Miami pact that was leaked into the Financial Times and that was subsequently modified. Those points relate to the US takeover of the $300 billion, more or less, of central bank sovereign funds that have been seized, confiscated, frozen, and remain in Europe principally. There's a Russian view that would be far better for Russian profit to have the $300 billion in a fund that Russia manages with the United States, to have the money returned to Elvira Nabiullina, the governor of the central bank. Now, you have to understand Russian factional politics to understand how much the governor of the central bank, Governor Nabiullina, is hated. And if you don't like that term, let's say distrusted for running this extremely high key rate that's damaging Russia's growth prospects. There's an entire lobby against the Russian central bank and its principal state bank allies for their ruble rate policy, for their reserves policy, and so on and so forth. So there's a view that an American-run administration of the $300 billion as a fund, an investment fund, in which Russian business interests direct, not Nabiullina, would be a plus for them personally. I don't know that Dmitriev is running that line. I'm voicing it because it's real in Moscow, though you won't read it in the Russian newspapers for obvious reasons. It's perfectly obvious how the business lobby thinks of Nabiullina's key rate. We've talked about that before. So to sum up, Dmitriev is in Miami to make the more complex deal that he is not talking about seem lucrative, profitable, money earning for the Trump circle and for its principal allies. That doesn't solve some of the key issues. There is no compromise, my sources repeat, and President Putin's repeated it. There's no compromise on the territorial issues. There's no compromise on the security requirements. As you said, each of these things require military precision and expertise and diplomatic precision and expertise, and there's plenty of it on the Russian side.